You know, folks, you hear stories about the wild, don't you? About things that happen way out past the last paved road, things that sound like folklore until they happen right to you. I'm not talking about Bigfoot or flying saucers. I'm talking about nature, raw, tooth and claw nature, and the moment when something ancient and wild looks you right in the eye and makes a choice that defies everything you thought you knew about the world. My name is Jake, and for the better part of 15 years, my address was a tent, then a small, rickety cabin, somewhere deep in the Bitterroot National Forest, Montana. I'm a photographer, specializing in the stuff that doesn't want to be photographed. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, and, most importantly, the timber wolves that run these mountains. The Bitterroots are tough country. The pines are thick, the winters come early and stay late, and if you get hurt out there, the only sound you're going to hear is the wind mocking you. That's why I loved it. It was honest. I'd been tracking a specific pack for about 3 seasons. We called them the North Fork Pack. They were famous among the few biologists who bothered to venture this far north, big animals, smart, and notoriously shy. But there was one among them, a male, who was different. He was massive, even for a timber wolf. His coat was a deep, charcoal gray, almost black in the shadows, and his eyes, well, his eyes were the color of cold river ice. I nicknamed him Shadow. I never got close enough for a clean shot, not the kind of shot you put on a magazine cover, but I saw him. I saw him move through the scrub oak like smoke. I watched him hunt elk with a precision that was terrifying, and I watched him interact with his pack. See, Shadow wasn't the alpha. Not yet. The alpha was an old brute we called Talon. Talon was fierce, but he was slowing down. He was getting irritable, making mistakes, and relying too much on brute force where Shadow used cunning. I could feel the tension in the forest every time the pack gathered. It was like holding a live wire. Every movement, every low growl, was a negotiation for power. I knew the rules of the wild. They are simple. The pack is everything. You submit or you fight, and if you fight, you better win, because the moment you are exiled, you are dead. A lone wolf, especially one carrying the scent of defeat, doesn't last long out there. That particular year, winter came down like a fist in late October. I mean, a real Montana snow dump. I was holed up in my cabin, which was maybe 10 miles past the point where the Forest Service even bothered to plow. I had my supplies, my camera gear, and a stack of books ready to ride out the first big storm. It was the 3rd night of the blizzard when I heard the sound. Now I'm used to the sounds of the woods, the whistle of the wind through the chimney, the creak of the frozen trees, the howl of the wolves. That's just background music for me. But this was different. This wasn't a territorial call or a hunting signal. This was rage. This was the sound of a serious life-or-death fight. I grabbed my binoculars and my heavy coat, and I went out. I know, stupid. You don't walk toward a wolf fight. But my curiosity, especially concerning Shadow and Talon, always got the better of me. I snowshoed maybe 1.5 miles, following the sounds down into a small clearing known as the Devil's Bowl. The snow was coming down so hard it felt like I was walking through wet concrete, but the light from the full moon, diffused by the clouds, gave the scene an eerie blue glow. And there they were, the North Fork Pack, maybe 8 strong, gathered in a tight circle. In the center, Talon and Shadow were locked up. It wasn't a sparring match. This was the final bloody showdown for dominance. Talon was old, but he was fighting with the desperation of a king who knows his crown is slipping. Shadow was younger, faster, and smarter, but he wasn't fighting to kill his alpha. He was fighting to win. There's a crucial difference there. He wanted submission, not execution. The fight was brutal. Fur flew. The snow around them was turning dark. I stood frozen behind a thick stand of fur, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid the wolves would hear it over their own snarls. Talon managed to land a nasty bite on Shadow's front left shoulder, a deep tear. Shadow yelped, a sound I'd never heard from him before, a sound of pain mixed with disbelief. but that pain seemed to trigger something primal. Shadow surged forward, not targeting the throat, but Talon's flank, driving him down into the heavy snow. Talon was pinned. He thrashed, snapping wildly, his eyes full of fear. Shadow stood over him, breathing hard, his massive jaws hovering inches from Talon's neck. This was the moment. The Alpha had been beaten. All Shadow had to do was assert his victory, force Talon to roll over and expose his throat, and the Pack would accept the new order. But Talon didn't submit. He didn't roll. He was too old, too proud, too consumed by his fear of irrelevance. Instead, Talon did something cowardly, something that violated the unwritten code of the Pack. He let out a piercing, pitiful howl, a distress call, not a challenge, and the rest of the Pack responded, not to Shadow, the victor, but to the Alpha's plea for help. In a flash, the loyalty shifted. The other wolves, intimidated by Shadow's strength but bound by the old guard, surged forward. They didn't attack Shadow directly, but they surrounded him, cutting him off from the fallen Talon. They were telling him, "Enough." Shadow looked around, his head turning slowly. He looked at the faces of the wolves he had hunted beside for years, his siblings, his cousins, the females he had protected. Their eyes were cold, judgmental. They were choosing the failing Alpha over the stronger challenger. They were choosing tradition over survival. It was a rejection, complete and total. Shadow didn't fight them. He didn't snarl back. He just lowered his head, a gesture of profound exhaustion and confusion. He knew what this meant. He was no longer one of them. Talon, seizing the opportunity, scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his muzzle. He didn't hesitate. He lunged at Shadow's exposed rear leg, delivering a vicious, tearing bite. Shadow let out another cry, a deep, guttural sound of betrayal this time, and spun away, limping immediately. He lunged past the surrounding Pack, not attacking, but fleeing. He rocketed out of the Devil's Bowl, dragging his wounded leg, disappearing into the swirling snow and the darkness. The Pack didn't follow. They howled, a long, unified, mournful sound, sealing the exile. It was a sound that said, "You are alone now. You are prey." I stood there for a long time, shivering, watching the Pack retreat back toward their den site, leaving the bloody snow behind. The storm intensified, wiping away their tracks almost instantly. I knew Shadow was badly hurt. A wound like that, combined with the extreme cold and the isolation, was a death sentence. Wolves rely on speed and stamina. A crippled wolf starves or worse, becomes food for a mountain lion. Should have gone back to my cabin. That was the smart thing, the logical thing, the legal thing. The Forest Service rules are clear. You observe, you do not interfere. The moment you interfere, you mess with the natural order and you put yourself in danger. But I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. Those cold, intelligent, ice-colored eyes full of disbelief as his family turned on him. I waited until the sounds of the Pack were long gone, swallowed by the wind. Then I pulled my collar up, adjusted my snowshoes, and started moving in the direction Shadow had taken. He couldn't have gone far with that injury. The trail of blood, faint but persistent, was already being covered by the fresh powder. I moved slowly, cautiously, my rifle slung across my back. Not that I planned on using it, but you don't walk wounded wolf territory unarmed. The blood trail led me uphill, toward the higher, more protected ridges where I knew there were some shallow caves and overhangs. He was looking for shelter, a place to hide and lick his wounds until he died. It took me another hour of difficult slogging through the deepening snow. The wind was whipping snow dust into my eyes, and my lungs were burning from the cold air. Finally, I reached a spot I knew well. A small granite overhang nestled beneath a cluster of massive old cedar trees. It was protected from the wind and offered a dry floor. I stopped maybe 50 feet short of the overhang. I didn't want to sneak up on him. If he was in pain, he'd be aggressive. I lowered myself into the snow, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Shadow? It's just me. Jake." Silence. Only the roar of the wind. I waited. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the dark recess under the granite. And then I saw him. He was curled up tight, his head resting on his paws. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The front of his gray coat was matted with crimson snow, and his injured leg was stretched out awkwardly. He was shivering violently. He wasn't asleep. He was in shock. As my eyes adjusted, I realized he was staring right back at me. Even in the gloom, those pale, icy eyes were fixed on my position. He knew I was there. He had known for a while. He didn't growl. He didn't snap. He simply watched. I knew that if he had the strength, he would have vanished. But he didn't. He was too weak to run, too injured to fight, and too exhausted to even bother threatening the trespasser. This was the moment of truth. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a wolf I was observing through a telephoto lens anymore. This was a dying animal, an exiled king, and I was the only witness. I had medical supplies in my pack: antibiotics, bandages, disinfectant. Supplies meant for me, of course, but supplies nonetheless. The rational voice in my head screamed, "Leave him! It's the circle of life. You can't save a wild predator." But then I thought about the fight. I thought about the sheer injustice of that moment when his own family had turned against him. He wasn't just injured, he was betrayed. And in that moment, something broke inside me. The line between observer and participant, a Dixie line I had guarded for 15 years, dissolved. I reached into my bag and slowly, deliberately, pulled out a package of dried venison jerky. It was tough stuff, usually too salty for me, but it was protein. I stood up, holding the jerky loosely in my open hand. I took a slow, measured step toward the overhang. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, my voice rough from the cold. "Tough night, huh?" Shadow watched me. His ears twitched, but his body remained still. He was conserving every bit of energy, deciding whether I was a threat worth dying fighting, or just a strange, two-legged creature that could be ignored until the end. I took another step. The distance closed to about 40 feet. I tossed the package of jerky into the snow, aiming to land at a good 30 feet from his shelter. It made a soft thud. I backed away slowly, never turning my back until I was behind the cover of the cedar trees again. I stayed there, shivering, waiting, watching. A full minute passed, maybe two. I could barely see him through the falling snow. Then, slowly, Shadow lifted his head. He sniffed the air, ignoring the jerky package, focusing instead on my scent trail. He didn't trust the food. He was trying to gauge my intentions. Finally, very carefully, he extended his injured leg, testing his weight. He managed to drag himself forward a few inches, whining softly in pain. He stopped, exhausted. He looked back at the shadow of the cedar trees where I was hidden. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. He dragged himself again, closer to the jerky. He was clearly starving. The fight had drained him entirely. When he reached the package, he didn't rip it open. He just rested his muzzle on it, breathing heavily. He was too weak even for that simple task. I knew I had to push the boundary further. If he didn't eat, he wouldn't make it through the night. I stepped out from behind the tree, slowly, my hands empty. I had my knife ready, but I wasn't holding it aggressively. I approached the package of jerky. Shadow saw me coming. This time, he managed a weak, rattling growl deep in his chest. It was a warning, but it lacked conviction. I stopped 10 feet away. I knelt down, pulled out my knife, and sliced through the plastic packaging. The smell of the smoked meat wafted out into the cold air. I separated a small strip of venison and placed it on the fresh snow, about 6 feet from his nose. Then I backed up again, slowly, until I was behind the cedar. The wild thing in the overhang was watching me. I was performing an act that defied everything he knew about humans and everything I knew about wolves. I was offering aid to a creature that was genetically programmed to fear and avoid me. I waited. The wind howled louder. Finally, Shadow lifted his head, looked at the strip of meat, then looked at the cedar tree where I was hiding. His eyes were heavy, dull with pain, but they held a question. He didn't move for the meat immediately. He just stared at the spot where I had been. He seemed to be weighing the risk of the human against the certainty of death by starvation and exposure. Then, with a painful, dragging lurch, he extended his neck and snatched the small piece of meat. He swallowed it in one quick gulp, his teeth barely working. He didn't look grateful. He looked bewildered. I knew I was in deep now. I had stepped across the line. I couldn't just leave him to die after feeding him once. This wasn't just about saving a wolf. It was about honoring the strange, silent transaction that had just taken place between two beings isolated by the savage night. The storm was raging, the temperature was dropping fast, and I had just made a commitment to a creature that could, and probably would, tear my throat out the minute it regained its strength. "All right, Shadow," I whispered to the empty air, pulling my scarf tighter around my face. "Let's see if we can get you through the night." I knew the next step was impossible. I had to get closer. I had to stabilize that leg and keep him warm. I had to choose the wolf over the comfortable safety of my own pack, the human world, just as he had been chosen against by his own. I turned and started trudging back toward my cabin, not to stay there, but to gather the things I needed for a long, dangerous vigil. I was going to be the lone wolf now, too, watching over my impossible charge. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that if the pack found out he was still alive, they wouldn't just finish him off. They would finish off anyone trying to help him. And that meant me. The walk back to the cabin was the longest 1.5 miles of my life. Every step I took felt like I was walking backward through cement. The snow was up to my knees now, and the adrenaline that had been pumping during the fight had completely drained away, leaving me cold and profoundly shaky. I kept thinking, "What in the hell are you doing, Jake?" This wasn't some wounded deer or bird with a broken wing. This was Shadow, a top-tier predator, the kind of animal that could take down a full-grown bull elk. And I was planning on playing nursemaid. It was insane, it was illegal, and it was going to get me killed. But the image of his eyes, those ice-blue eyes watching me with that mix of pain and utter disbelief, kept overriding the common sense. He hadn't fought me. He hadn't even truly threatened me when I sliced open the jerky package. He was beaten, exiled, and dying, and in his moment of greatest weakness, he had accepted help from the one creature he should have feared most. That acceptance, silent and agonizing, was a hook I couldn't shake off. When I finally reached the cabin, I didn't waste a second. The door slammed shut, and the sound seemed deafening after the quiet roar of the blizzard. I yanked off my wet coat and went straight for my emergency kit. I needed supplies, and I needed them fast before hypothermia claimed him, or before the pack decided to circle back and confirm the kill. First, I grabbed the heavy-duty stuff. I had a small old veterinarian kit that I kept strictly for emergencies, mostly for the dogs I used to run with years ago. In it were some serious, broad-spectrum antibiotics, the kind you have to keep locked up, and some industrial-strength disinfectant, the nasty orange stuff that burns like fire but kills everything. Then came comfort. I grabbed a thick wool blanket, an old army surplus one, and carefully folded it. I knew I couldn't just throw it on him. He'd probably shred it in a panic. But maybe I could place it near him for warmth. Food was next. The jerky was a start, but he needed something easier to digest and higher in fat. I found a can of high-protein dog food, the kind I used for tracking trips, and sealed it tightly in a Ziploc bag so the strong scent wouldn't travel too far and draw unwanted company. Finally, the tools of the trade. A length of sturdy rope, not for binding him, that would be suicide, but for setting up a barrier, maybe a small perimeter if I could manage it, and my rifle, of course. I checked the chamber, loaded it, and slung it across my shoulder. This wasn't for Shadow. This was for Talon, or for anything else that might mistake me for an easy meal in the dark. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. I was moving on pure adrenaline now, my hands shaking only slightly as I packed the heavy canvas rucksack. Stepping back out into the blizzard felt like diving into a frozen river. The snow was relentless. It was a true Montana whiteout, and navigating back to the Devil's Bowl was treacherous. I relied entirely on the compass and the memory of the landscape, knowing that if I missed that granite overhang, I might wander for hours and freeze solid. It took me nearly 2 hours to cover the same distance I had covered in 45 minutes on the way out. When I finally approached the stand of cedars, the silence was unnerving. The wind still roared, but the small clearing felt empty. My heart seized up. He's gone. He died, or he dragged himself away to hide. I stopped 30 feet, out, dropped my pack softly, and pulled out my binoculars. The snow was still falling hard, but the blue moonlight was trying to pierce the clouds again. I scanned the overhang. He was still there. He hadn't moved an inch. He was exactly where I had left him, curled into a tight ball, his breathing still shallow. But the jerky strip was gone. He had eaten it. I took a deep, shaky breath, letting the tension flood out of my shoulders. He was alive. This time, I didn't whisper. I spoke in a low, even tone, the kind of voice you use to calm a spooked horse. "Okay, Shadow, I'm back. I've got to get closer now. You need help." I approached slowly, holding the heavy pack in front of me, partially as a shield, partially as a distraction. I stopped about 15 feet from the mouth of the overhang. He lifted his head just enough to track me. His ears were flat against his skull, a clear sign of pain and fear, but he didn't attempt to stand. He couldn't. I knelt down in the snow, pulled the blanket out and unfolded it slowly, letting the scent of wool and wood smoke drift toward him. "This is for the cold, buddy," I murmured. "It's not a trap. It's just warm." I tossed the blanket gently, aiming for the ground directly in front of the overhang. It landed with a soft poof in the snow. He watched it, his eyes flicking from the blanket to my face, then back to the blanket. The fear was still there, but now it was layered with a deep, consuming exhaustion. This was the hardest part, the medical intervention. I knew I couldn't treat that deep bite wound on his flank from 10 feet away. I had to get close enough to clean it and administer the antibiotic injection. I pulled out the orange disinfectant bottle and a large syringe, already prepped with the heavy veterinary antibiotic. I held them up, making sure he could see my hands were busy with non-threatening objects. "This is going to hurt, Shadow," I warned him, my voice still low. "But if we don't clean that, you're dead by morning. We're running out of time." I took 3 slow, agonizing steps forward, closing the distance to maybe 7 feet. I was well within his striking range now. If he decided to attack, I wouldn't have time to raise my rifle, or even draw my knife. I stopped. I could smell the metallic tang of his blood mixed with the clean scent of pine needles. He managed a low, rasping growl again, the sound vibrating in his chest. It was a protest, a final declaration of his wildness, but it was weak. I lowered myself onto my knees, resting my pack beside me. I pulled out a small, high-powered LED flashlight and pointed it carefully at his wound. The sight was bad. Talon's bite had torn through a thick layer of muscle tissue on the upper rear leg. It was deep, ragged, and actively oozing. Worse, the cold had slowed the bleeding, but it hadn't stopped it, and the wound was already contaminated with snow and dirt. I knew I had to work fast. I took the disinfectant bottle, uncapped it, and slowly extended my arm toward him. "Please, just hold still," I pleaded, feeling ridiculous talking to a wolf but needing the sound of my own voice to keep me grounded. As the bottle came within 3 feet, Shadow tensed. His lips curled back in a silent snarl, showing teeth that were still terrifyingly sharp, even in his diminished state. I hesitated. One wrong move, one sudden flinch from me, and he'd snap. I waited 5 seconds, maybe 10, just holding the bottle steady, letting him see that I wasn't backing down, but I wasn't attacking either. Then, very deliberately, I poured a small amount of the disinfectant onto the wound. The moment the liquid hit his exposed flesh, Shadow arched his back and let out a howl of pure, uncontrolled agony. It wasn't a pack howl. It was a shriek of pain that echoed off the granite. He thrashed wildly, trying to spin around, but his injured leg wouldn't cooperate. He snapped his jaws, not at me, but at the air, trying to bite the pain away. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. But the pain, as intense as it was, seemed to shock him into momentary stillness. He collapsed back down, panting desperately, his massive chest heaving. I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before he recovered enough to try something else. Moving with the precision of someone defusing a bomb, I quickly swabbed the area with a piece of gauze soaked in the antiseptic. Then I took the syringe. I had to administer the shot deep into the muscle, near the shoulder, away from the immediate trauma. This required me to lean in, closer than any sane human should ever get to a trapped, injured wolf. I leaned in, my face inches from his head. I could feel his hot, ragged breath on my cheek. I could see the tiny veins in his ice-colored eyes. "Easy, boy, just a pinch," I whispered. I quickly found the spot, plunged the needle home, and depressed the plunger. Shadow barely flinched this time. He just closed his eyes, accepting the sharp stab of the needle with a profound, almost human resignation. He was too spent to fight anymore. When I pulled the needle out and capped it, I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off him. I retreated to the 7-foot line and sat heavily in the snow, exhausted by the sheer tension of the last few minutes. I watched him for a long time. The immediate thrashing had stopped. The shivering was still there, but maybe slightly less violent. The antibiotic and the cleaning would begin the long, slow process of healing. I knew I couldn't leave him completely exposed. The temperature was still dropping and the wind was vicious. I took the wool blanket and, using the rope, carefully secured one end to a nearby cedar tree, creating a low, partial windbreak near the mouth of the overhang. I didn't try to cover him with it, but I positioned it so the heat radiating from his body might be trapped by the wool, offering a marginal increase in warmth. Then I opened the can of wet food. The smell was strong, meaty, and enticing. I scooped a small amount onto the snow, mixing it with a bit of water from my canteen to make it easier to lick up. I placed the mixture about 4 feet from him. "Eat this, Shadow," I said, quieter now. "You need the strength." I retreated further back to the cover of the cedars where I had left my pack. I wasn't going to sleep, not tonight. I was going to be the lookout. I sat with my back against the rough bark of the cedar, pulling my coat tight. The storm howled, but inside my tiny perimeter the sound was muted. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark shape of the wolf. He ignored the food for a long time. He was still processing the violation, the pain, the touch, the strange medicinal smell. But hunger, as always, won the debate. Slowly, tentatively, he reached for the food. He licked it up in small, careful mouthfuls, consuming the high-calorie paste efficiently. When he was done, he licked the snow clean, a sign that he was truly starving. He then lifted his head, not looking at the food, but looking straight at me, hidden in the shadows of the tree line. In that moment, I felt a connection far deeper than anything I had ever experienced observing nature through a lens. This wasn't observation. This was coexistence, based on a fragile life-or-death treaty. He was trading his natural hostility for survival. The night was long and brutal. I focused on small tasks to stay awake and warm. I used my knife to scrape away the snow around my feet, creating a small, slightly drier spot. I sipped hot coffee from my thermos, listening to the forest. Every hour, I performed a perimeter check. The greatest fear wasn't Shadow, it was Talon and the North Fork Pack. If they caught my scent mixed with Shadow's, they would interpret it as a challenge, and they would come for both of us. I heard things: the rustle of a snowshoe hare, the distant cry of a great horned owl, but nothing that sounded like heavy paws on the fresh snow. The blizzard was my shield. It covered our tracks and muffled the sounds. Around 3 a.m., Shadow started making soft, whining sounds. They were involuntary, born of fever and deep pain. He was twisting slightly, trying to find a position that didn't hurt his leg. I knew he was burning up. I considered giving him an anti-inflammatory, but I was worried about upsetting his stomach or causing complications with the antibiotics. I decided against it. I had done what I could. Now it was up to his ancient, wild constitution. I spent the rest of the night talking softly, just rambling about nothing. About the view from my cabin in the summer, about the dumb things people do in the city, about how quiet the world was right now. I didn't expect him to understand the words, but I wanted him to hear the non-threatening cadence of a human voice. As the first gray hints of dawn began to smudge the eastern horizon, the storm finally started to abate. The wind dropped, and the heavy, continuous snowfall eased to a light dust of powder. I stretched my stiff muscles, the cold having seeped into my bones. I looked toward the overhang. Shadow was still there, but he was positioned differently. He had managed to shift himself completely onto the wool blanket I had placed down, and he was sleeping, or at least unconscious in a deep rest. His breathing was still quick, but it seemed slightly more even. I felt a surge of weary relief. He had made it through the worst part of the night. But morning brought new, immediate dangers. The clearing skies meant visibility, and visibility meant the pack could move again. I scooped out more of the wet food and placed it near him, along with a bowl of snow that I knew would melt quickly into drinking water. I settled back under the cedar, watching. I didn't need binoculars now. The light was clear. About an hour after sunrise, Shadow slowly woke up. He stretched, testing his limbs, and winced badly when he put any pressure on the injured leg. He saw the food and water immediately. He ate the food slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the cedar tree where I was stationed. When he finished, he looked at me again. This time, there was no hostility in his gaze, but a clear, calculating intelligence. It was a look that said, "You are the one who provides." This was the critical moment. The temporary truce of desperation was over. He had regained some strength. Now he had to decide if I was worth the risk. He was a wolf. He was programmed to flee or fight. I remained still, letting him make the move. He stood up, finally, struggling onto 3 legs. He was huge. Even weakened, he was a magnificent, terrifying animal. He took a few hesitant steps out of the overhang, dragging his bad leg, testing the snow. He was facing the open forest, the direction of the pack's territory. He could run. He could choose the loneliness of exile over the vulnerability of proximity to a human. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the pines. Then he turned. He didn't look at the food. He looked at me. He took 2 more steps toward the cedar tree, closing the distance to maybe 20 feet. I didn't move a muscle. I just held his gaze. He lowered his massive head and let out a single, low, soft noise. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a challenge. It was a sound I had never heard a wild wolf make before. It sounded like a question. I understood the question. What now? I shifted slightly, reaching into my pack and pulling out a small, rolled-up tarp. "Now, we build you a better den, Shadow," I whispered. "We hide you." I stood up slowly. Instead of running back toward the forest, the lone wolf turned, limped back into the protection of the granite overhang, and lay down on the wool blanket, waiting for me. He had chosen the human. I knew this was the point of no return. If I was going to keep him alive long enough to heal, I couldn't just visit. I had to establish a small temporary camp right here, right next to the exiled Alpha in waiting. I was committing to days, maybe weeks, of dangerous cohabitation, inches away from a top predator. I started working immediately, moving the tarp and some dry firewood I had brought. I had to be fast, efficient, and silent. The sun was climbing, and the pack would be stirring. I used the tarp to extend the roof of the granite overhang, creating a deeper, more protected entrance. I gathered pine boughs and layered them over the roof for insulation and camouflage. I built a small, smokeless fire pit further back in the cedars, just enough to boil water and keep the chill away from my own precarious shelter. I was finishing securing the tarp when I heard it. Not a howl, but a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the snap of a twig, followed by the soft, rhythmic padding of heavy paws on the melting snow. They were close, too close. I dropped the tarp, grabbed my rifle, and melted into the deepest shadow of the cedar stand. I could see the overhang clearly, and I could see Shadow, who had instantly become alert, his ears swiveling. He hadn't made a sound. He was using every ounce of his ingrained survival instinct. Two shadows materialized silently at the edge of the Devil's Bowl clearing, sniffing the air. They were two of the smaller wolves from the North Fork pack, young males, probably sent out by Talon to scout, to confirm the scent of death, or maybe to find the carcass. They paused, their muzzles low to the ground, instantly catching the complex mixture of scents. Old blood, fresh snow, human wood smoke, and the overwhelming, undeniable scent of Shadow. They didn't see the overhang immediately, hidden as it was by the cedar and the new tarp, but they saw my tracks. The heavy tread of my snowshoes, the fresh disturbance in the snow where I had built the windbreak. They lifted their heads, their cold eyes narrowed, focusing on the stand of cedars. They knew a human had been here. They knew a human was still here. The two scouts exchanged a silent glance, then they turned their attention back to the strong scent of the exiled wolf. They moved slowly, cautiously, toward the overhang. I gripped the rifle, my knuckles white. I was ready. If they attacked Shadow, or if they came for me, I had no choice. Shadow, still crippled, rose slightly, a low, barely audible growl rumbling in his throat. He was ready to fight to the death. The scouts reached the entrance to the overhang. They stopped, their eyes adjusting to the gloom, confirming the presence of their exiled packmate. Then something extraordinary happened. They didn't lunge, they didn't challenge. They froze, confused by the strange addition to the scene. The human smell was everywhere, and right next to Shadow, there was the smell of cooked meat and the foreign scent of medicine. They looked at Shadow. Then they looked at the tarp, the blanket, and the fresh human tracks leading right up to the mouth of the den. They were seeing something that violated the fundamental law of the wild. The human was not attacking. The human was protecting. One of the scouts, a nervous, light-colored male, whined softly, a sound of confusion and fear. He looked back toward the woods, clearly wanting to report this impossible situation to Talon. But the second scout, darker and bolder, took one step closer to the overhang, trying to get a better look at Shadow's injury. Before he could get closer, Shadow did something that shocked me to my core. He didn't growl at the scout. He didn't even look at the scout. He looked straight past the two wolves, directly at the dents, shadows where I was hiding. It was a clear, silent communication, a demand. And then he let out a short, sharp bark, a warning, directed not at the scouts, but at me. It was his way of saying, "Don't move. Don't reveal yourself. This is my fight." He was protecting the secret of our alliance. He was choosing me, the human resource, over his need to intimidate his former packmates. The two scouts, seeing the formidable, if injured, Shadow, still occupying the space and sensing the strange, heavy presence of the human protector, decided the risk was too great. They turned quickly and silently retreated into the forest, vanishing as swiftly as they had appeared. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Sweat trickled down my spine, cold against my skin. I waited until I could no longer hear their movements. Then, slowly, I emerged from the shadows. Shadow was watching me. He was breathing heavily, the exertion having clearly cost him. I walked over to the overhang, knelt down, and looked him in the eye. "You barked at me, you big idiot," I managed, a shaky smile playing on my lips. He just blinked slowly. "You just bought us some time," I continued, pulling my pack closer. "But they know you're alive, and they know something is wrong here. Talon won't send scouts next time. He'll come himself." I knew I was right. The truce was established, but the war was just beginning. Now I had to keep a dying wolf alive, hide him from a vengeful pack, and do it all while living out of a sleeping bag in a Montana winter. I was officially the guardian of the lone wolf, and my life expectancy had just dropped dramatically. This was it. I was officially running a black market medical clinic for an exiled king of the mountains. I wasted no time. Those scouts had gone back to Talon. They had reported the impossible. Shadow was alive, and a human was involved. Talon wasn't going to stand for that disrespect to the natural order. We had maybe 24 hours, tops, before the whole North Fork pack came back to settle the score. I finished setting up my own little camp. It wasn't much, just a small tarp strung between two cedars, my sleeping bag laid out on a thick bed of pine needles, and the smokeless fire pit I'd built. It was cold, brutally cold, but dry. The first few days were a blur of absolute, paralyzing tension. Imagine trying to give first aid to a creature that, even in its weakened state, could crush your hand with a casual snap. I had to clean that wound twice a day. The first time, when I poured the disinfectant, Shadow had screamed. The second time, he just braced himself, his muscles corded like steel cables, letting out a low, continuous rumble that vibrated through the granite floor. It wasn't a growl of threat, it was a sound of endurance. I started talking to him constantly, not about important things, but about the mundane. "The snow's letting up, buddy. Good thing, or I'd be out of jerky. My back hurts like hell, you know that. Sleeping on this frozen ground is for the birds." I needed him to associate my voice, my presence, with predictability and relief, not just pain. He never responded with a wagging tail or a lick, not even close. Shadow was all wolf. His eyes, those cold, river ice eyes, were always on me. They tracked every movement, every breath. It was like living under the gaze of a constant, highly intelligent security camera. But the trust, if you could call it that, grew in minute increments. On day 2, I ran out of the high-protein canned food. I had to hunt. Hunting meant leaving the camp, which meant leaving Shadow vulnerable, and it meant moving around the forest, which was dangerous. I managed to take down a snowshoe hare about a mile away. When I brought it back, a fresh kill, still warm, Shadow lifted his head, nostrils flaring. I didn't try to feed it to him. I just skinned it right there, 10 feet from the overhang, making sure he saw the entire process. I was demonstrating competence. I wasn't just a provider of jerky, I was a hunter. I tossed the best cuts of meat onto the snow in front of him. Raw, rich protein. He ate it immediately, violently. The difference between the canned food and the fresh kill was palpable. His strength was already starting to return. That night, I woke up to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a low, rattling sigh right outside my tarp shelter. My heart vaulted into my throat. I grabbed my rifle, silently chambered around, and pulled the tarp flap aside an inch. It was Shadow. He wasn't attacking. He was lying maybe 3 feet from the entrance to my shelter, his head resting on his paws. He was using the small amount of warmth radiating from my body and my tiny fire pit. He was close enough to kill me with a single lunge, but he was choosing to share the heat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched him, the moonlight glinting off his charcoal fur. After about 20 minutes, he shifted slightly and let out a deep, contented sigh, the kind a big dog makes after a long walk. Then he closed his eyes and drifted off. That was the moment. That was when I realized the Alliance wasn't just about food and medicine. It was about companionship in exile. He was alone, and I was the only other living thing that hadn't betrayed him. The next few days settled into a routine that felt surreal. I'd wake up, check his wound, change the dressing, which he tolerated with gritted teeth, feed him, and then spend hours tending the camp, always aware of the forest perimeter. His leg was healing. The antibiotics were working and the swelling was receding. He was starting to put tentative weight on it, favoring it still, but moving with less visible pain. And the pack knew. We started hearing them every night. Not the casual, territorial howls. These were organized, angry, close. They were scent marking the ridges above us, pushing the boundaries. They were trying to panic him, to force him to flee, to lure him out into the open where they could finish the job without having to deal with the strange human scent nearby. One afternoon, while I was out checking some snares, I found a clear sign. Talon's scat, left right on the trail I used to get back to the cabin. It was his way of saying, "I know you are here. I know what you are doing." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Talon wasn't just challenging Shadow now, he was challenging me. And Talon was a brute. When I got back to the overhang, I looked at Shadow. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He was lying alertly, his ears constantly rotating, listening to the silence that now felt heavier than the storm. "They're getting closer, buddy," I whispered, sitting down near him. "You need to be able to run, and you're not there yet." We needed more time, but time was the one thing Talon wasn't going to give us. I decided we had to become invisible. I spent the next day meticulously covering every sign of my presence. I packed up my tiny fire pit, scattering the ashes far into the deep snow. I layered more pine boughs and snow over the tarp shelter, making it blend seamlessly into the granite wall. I even used my rifle, but to smooth out the snowshoe prints leading into the camp. We had to rely on absolute silence and camouflage. This meant no more hot food for me, and no more noisy movements. I was eating cold jerky and hard biscuits, shivering constantly, but it was worth it if it bought us a couple more days of healing. On the 5th day of our strange partnership, the ultimate test of trust arrived. I was finishing up the morning bandage change. I was kneeling right next to Shadow's flank, my head bent low, concentrating on wrapping the gauze tight enough to hold but not so tight as to restrict circulation. Suddenly, a massive branch, heavily laden with ice and snow, snapped off one of the ancient cedars above us. It hit the ground 10 feet away with a thunderous crack. The sound was explosive. It was the sound of a gunshot or a sudden, violent attack. My survival instinct took over. I didn't think. I just reacted. I flinched violently, jerking my arm back and slamming my shoulder into the side of the granite wall. In the same instant, Shadow flinched. He was a wild animal, terrified by the sudden noise and the human's unpredictable movement inches from his throat. His entire body coiled. He snapped his massive head around, his teeth flashing, aimed directly for my exposed arm. It was pure reflex, the final, desperate defense of a wild creature. I froze, knowing I was dead. I could feel the heat and the sharp, musky scent of his breath on my skin. His jaws closed, but they didn't close on my arm. They stopped. In the final millimeter of the strike, he checked himself. His teeth clicked together just beside my elbow, but they didn't penetrate the skin. He held the position for a terrifying second, snarling, vibrating with primal fear and aggression, and then, slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his head. He pulled his muzzle back, breathing heavily. He hadn't attacked. He had overridden the most basic, deeply ingrained instinct of his species: attack the sudden threat. I sat back on my heels, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. My arm was shaking. If he had bitten down, he would have shattered the bone. I didn't yell. I didn't even pull my arm away quickly. I just looked at him, trying to keep the terror out of my eyes. Shadow looked back at me, his eyes wide, perhaps shocked at his own restraint. He knew what he had almost done. He knew he had just chosen the fragile alliance over his own reflex. This wasn't just trust. This was a bond forged in mutual desperation and respect. He had decided I was more important alive than dead, even when scared half to death. "Thank you, Shadow," I whispered, my voice rough. "That was close." He didn't respond. He just leaned his head back down onto his paws, watching me with a new intensity. The air between us had changed entirely. The professional distance was gone. We were partners in crime now. The next morning, day 6, I knew it was time for the next phase. Shadow was moving well enough on 3 legs to travel short distances. He was still weak, but he wasn't dying anymore. But we couldn't stay. The pack was closing in. I could hear their mourning. Howls ringing closer than ever, echoing off the high canyon walls. They were signaling a move. We had to get out of the North Fork territory and into the deep, high-altitude scrubland. The place the wolves rarely hunted. The place where the mountain lions ruled. It was dangerous, but it was our only chance at true safety. I packed my minimal supplies. I kept the heavy wool blanket, knowing he still needed the warmth. I secured the last of my dried meat and all my remaining medical supplies. I knelt before Shadow. "We're leaving," I told him, pointing west toward the highest ridge. "It's a long, tough walk, and you're going to hurt. But if we stay here, we both die." I stood up, slung my pack and rifle, and started walking slowly, deliberately, out of the small clearing. I didn't look back. I wanted him to make the choice on his own terms. I was asking him to put his life in my hands, following a 2-legged creature into unknown territory. I walked about 20 feet, my snowshoes crunching softly in the fresh morning powder. I waited. The silence behind me was heavy. Then I heard the soft, labored drag of his injured leg, followed by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of his 3 good paws. I risked a glance back. Shadow was right behind me, maybe 10 feet away. He was limping badly, his eyes focused intently on my back. He wasn't following like a pet. He was following like a scout, following a guide. He was putting his faith in my knowledge of the terrain. We started our trek. It was slow, excruciating work. The sun was out now, turning the snow blinding white, but the air was still frigid. We moved mostly along the game trails I knew well, paths that offered marginal shelter and easier footing. Every 50 yards, Shadow would stop, panting heavily, his muscles trembling from the exertion. And every time I would stop too, waiting patiently, not pressuring him. We were a bizarre pair. A man in heavy winter gear, rifle slung, leading a huge, crippled timber wolf through the wilderness. Around midday, we hit the first serious obstacle, a steep, icy incline leading up to the high ridge. It was slick, and even with my snowshoes, I had to use my hands to pull myself up. I made it to the top and looked down. Shadow was struggling at the base. He couldn't get traction on the ice, and he couldn't push off hard enough with his injured leg. He whined softly, frustrated and exhausted. I knew I couldn't just stand there. I went back down, carefully removing my pack and rifle, placing them out of the way. I took off my thick leather belt. I approached Shadow slowly, talking low and soothingly. Okay, buddy, we gotta do this together. This is going to feel weird, but you have to trust me. I looped the belt gently around his chest, just behind his front legs, creating a makeshift harness. He tensed instantly, letting out a short, sharp snarl of protest. Being constrained was the ultimate violation of his wildness. I won't hurt you, I promised. I just need to pull. I grabbed the end of the belt, turned, and started climbing the icy slope again, slowly increasing the tension on the belt. Shadow. Resisted for a moment, then desperation won. He realized he had no choice. He started scrambling, using his front paws to claw at the ice, and I pulled, taking some of the weight off his back end. It was a terrifying, grunting effort. We slipped and slid, snow spraying everywhere. My hands were raw from the friction of the belt. Finally, with one last desperate heave, we crested the ridge. Shadow collapsed onto the relatively flat ground, panting, like a steam engine, his breath clouding the air. I released the belt immediately. He didn't try to bite me or flee, he just lay there, recovering. I sat down next to him, rubbing the circulation back into my frozen hands. "See?" I said, breathless. "Teamwork." He looked at me, and for the first time, I thought I saw something beyond calculation in those ice-colored eyes. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe just acceptance of dependence, but it felt like a shared victory. We rested for an hour, feeding him the last of the fresh hare meat. The high ridge offered an incredible view back over the North Fork territory. As the afternoon sun began to dip, we heard it. It wasn't a single howl. It was a chorus, a deep, unified, chilling sound that rolled up the canyons and over the ridge like a physical wave. The pack was on the move. They had found the signs of our departure and were tracking us, and they sounded angry. Shadow reacted instantly. He struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg, and turned toward the sound. He let out a low, defiant growl, a challenge meant to carry on the wind. But I knew that sound wasn't meant for us. That sound was meant for the pack. It was Talon leading the hunt. "They're too close, Shadow," I said, grabbing my rifle. "We need to go. Now." We pushed on, moving faster now, spurred by the urgency. All of the chase. We were heading deeper into the high scrub, where the terrain was rugged and unforgiving. A good place to lose a pursuer, but a terrible place for an injured animal. As darkness fell, we found a perfect hiding spot. A dense, almost impenetrable thicket of stunted juniper bushes, nestled among large, fractured boulders. It offered cover, and the rocks would hold some residual heat from the day. I made a small, hidden nest for Shadow, layering the wool blanket down. I crawled into the thicket next to him, pulling my thin sleeping bag around me. We settled in, listening. The sounds of the pack were closer now. We could hear them crashing through the lower forest, their howls sharper, more focused. They were following our scent trail up the slope. Around midnight, the pack stopped moving. They had reached the base of the icy incline we had struggled up earlier. Silence. Then a single, furious howl that cut through the night. Talon. He was frustrated. The ice was slowing them down. I heard the sounds of heavy bodies struggling, the low snarls of frustration. They were trying to climb the slick slope. I glanced at Shadow. He was alert, his body coiled tight, ready for action, but he remained silent, conserving his energy. He knew Talon was coming. Then the pack fell silent again. They weren't giving up, they were regrouping. They were sending scouts to find another way around, or they were waiting for dawn. I spent the next few hours awake, rifle across my knees, listening to the night. I was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me sharp. As the cold reached its absolute nadir just before dawn, I heard a new sound, far too close. Not the heavy, clumsy movement of the full pack, but the stealthy, silent padding of a single, massive animal. Talon. He hadn't waited for the pack. He had found a way up the ridge by himself. Maybe he used a different, less icy path, or maybe he was simply so driven by rage that he powered through. He was sniffing the ground, following our trail right toward the juniper thicket. I knew he couldn't see us, but the scent was overwhelming. He was 5 feet away, then 3. I could hear his ragged, aggressive breathing. Shadow tensed beside me. He didn't growl. He was waiting. Talon paused right at the edge of our thicket. I could see the outline of his snout, the sharp points of his ears in the faint moonlight. He knew we were there. He was just confirming the exact position of his exiled rival and the strange human who harbored him. Talon let out a low, guttural challenge, a sound of pure, murderous intent. He was ready to pounce. I raised my rifle slightly, ready to fire a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare him off without having to hurt him. Before I could move, Shadow shifted. He didn't stand up, he just levered himself forward, positioning his head so it was inches from the edge of the juniper bush. He looked directly into Talon's eyes, and Shadow let out a noise that was not a challenge nor a submission. It was a clear, steady, warning growl, a sound that carried absolute authority and zero fear. But this time, the warning wasn't just directed at Talon. It was directed at the human hiding behind him. Shadow was telling me, "Do not interfere. This is between us." He was choosing to face his destiny, but he was choosing to do it on his own terms, protecting the fragile sanctuary I had provided. The deposed Alpha was laying down the law, not just to his former rival, but to his new, bizarre protector. The line had been crossed, and the final confrontation was about to begin. I lowered the rifle slowly, understanding that my time as the nursemaid was over and my role as the backup was about to start. Talon was moments away from lunging, and I was about to witness a war between two wolves, with a human caught right in the middle. The air froze solid around us. I mean that literally. It was the coldest hour of the night, and every molecule of oxygen felt like jagged glass in my lungs. I was pressed flat against the rock, the frozen juniper needles digging into my cheek, the cold steel of the rifle a meaningless weight in my hands. Talon was right there. I could smell the musk and the raw, aggressive scent of the Alpha. He didn't make a sound when he lunged. He simply detonated. The juniper bushes exploded inward. Talon was a blur of dark fur and snapping teeth aiming for the throat, the traditional killing blow. He was fueled by blind, desperate fury. But Shadow was waiting. Shadow didn't try to roll or dodge, which would have exposed his bad leg. Instead, he used the cramped confines of the thicket as his shield. He levered himself up onto his 3 good paws and met the charge head-on. It wasn't a fight for dominance this time. It was a fight for life, pure and simple. Talon's initial lunge missed the mark, deflected by the dense branches. Shadow, using the momentum of Talon's attack against him, didn't go for the throat either. He went for the face. There was a sickening crunch. Talon let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, not a howl, but a sound of surprise and searing pain. Shadow had locked onto his muzzle, clamping down hard, likely shattering bone. Talon thrashed wildly, shaking his head side to side, trying to dislodge the younger wolf. Shadow held on, a relentless vice grip. The fight was over in less than 10 seconds. It was decisive, brutal, and utterly silent, save for the sounds of tearing flesh and desperate breathing. Shadow released his grip with a sharp jerk, tearing away a chunk of fur and flesh. Talon staggered backward, spraying thick, dark blood onto the snow and juniper. He was disoriented, his muzzle ruined, his aggression replaced by shock and agonizing pain. He didn't look at Shadow. He looked at the dense shadows of the forest, the direction of safety. Talon had lost more than a fight this time. He had lost his nerve. He turned, whimpered once, a pitiful sound for an alpha, and vanished into the darkness, crashing clumsily down the slope we had just climbed. He wasn't running to fight another day. He was running to die alone, or to be finished off by his own pack, who would surely smell his defeat. The silence that followed was immense. I slowly pulled myself out of the juniper. Shadow was standing stiffly, breathing hard, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn gray. He was exhausted, but he was victorious. He was the Alpha now, even in exile. He looked at me, his eyes burning with intensity. He didn't need my rifle. He needed my silence. And he had gotten it. I walked over, trembling, and knelt beside him. I checked his injured leg. The trauma hadn't worsened it, thankfully, but he was bleeding heavily from a new bite on his shoulder, a glancing blow from Talon's desperate attack. "You won," I whispered, relief making my voice thick. "You did it." I quickly applied pressure to the new wound, using a clean piece of gauze. He tolerated the touch without a flicker of protest. The unspoken treaty was stronger than ever. We couldn't stay. Talon's pack would soon be climbing the ridge, drawn by the scent of blood and the sound of their defeated leader. "Time to move. Buddy," I said, packing up the blanket and the last of the jerky. We started walking immediately, heading west, away from the familiar hunting grounds, deeper into the desolate, high country. We walked all day, relentlessly, driven by the need to put miles between us and the North Fork pack. Shadow was hurting, but he moved with a new purpose. He walked slightly ahead of me now, not relying on me as a guide, but accepting me as a partner. He was leading us into safety. For the next 3 weeks, we lived like ghosts in the high Bitterroots. I set up a new, semi-permanent camp in a rocky canyon where the winds were fierce but the visibility was excellent. I hunted daily, bringing back squirrels, hares, and once, a small, unfortunate deer. I was feeding two now, a man and a king. Shadow healed with astonishing speed. The antibiotics had worked miracles, and the constant supply of high-quality protein fueled his recovery. His coat, once matted with dried blood and snow, became thick and sleek again. His limp faded from a painful drag to a barely noticeable favoring of the limb. And the wolf I had first seen, the massive, intelligent, terrifying predator, returned. He still slept near my fire pit at night, but he was no longer desperate for warmth. He did it because we were a unit. When I was out hunting, he would wait for me, always positioned to watch the approach trails. If a mountain lion screamed on the ridge, and they did, often sensing a rival, he wouldn't hide. He would stand, massive and silent, a charcoal shadow against the granite, asserting his presence. The dynamic shifted subtly. I was no longer the sole provider. I was the camp tender, the medic, the human that kept the scent barrier strong. He was the guard, the hunter, the wolf. We were two lone wolves, joined by a twist of fate, surviving the brutal Montana winter together. The defining moment came on a sunny afternoon in late January. The snow had settled, the air was crisp, and the forest felt alive again. Shadow was fully recovered. He was running short sprints now, testing his leg, moving with the fluid, effortless grace that had earned him the name Shadow in the first place. He didn't favor the leg at all. He was strong, magnificent, and ready. I was sitting on a rock, watching him. I knew what had to happen next. He came back to the camp, looked at me, and then walked to the edge of the canyon, where the forest opened up into vast, uncharted wilderness. He looked out toward the horizon, not back toward the North Fork, but forward. He paused there, perfectly still. He was waiting for my permission, or perhaps just my acknowledgement. I walked over to him, feeling a cold, sharp ache in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're healed, buddy," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're ready." I reached out my hand slowly, a gesture I had never dared before. I didn't try to pet him, just offered the back of my hand, open and vulnerable, near his massive head. He sniffed my hand, the scent of the human who had saved him, the scent of antiseptic and wood smoke and venison. He didn't retreat. He didn't bite. He lowered his head and gave my hand a single, rough lick, a quick, dry touch of acknowledgement, an ancient thank you. Then, just as quickly, he pulled away. He looked at me one last time. Those ice-blue eyes held no fear, no dependency, only a deep, wild understanding. He turned, and without a sound, without a backward glance, he slipped into the trees. He wasn't running. He was moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of a creature taking possession of its kingdom. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where he had disappeared. The king had left the camp. The exile was over. I didn't try to follow. I knew better. Our story was complete. He had chosen me over his pack in a moment of desperation, and in return, I had chosen him over the law and common sense. Now, he was choosing the wild again, as he should. It took me 3 days to break camp and hike back to my cabin. The world felt silent and empty. The sound of the wind was just the wind now, not a warning or a cover. When I finally got back to my rickety cabin, the first thing I did was sit down by the wood stove and stare at the wall. I wasn't just Jake the photographer anymore. I was Jake, the man who had shared a blanket with a timber wolf. I never saw Shadow again, not up close, but I knew he was out there. A few months later, when the snow finally melted and the Forest Service started running patrol again, one of the biologists stopped by my cabin. He was tracking the wolf packs. He mentioned that the North Fork pack had dissolved. Talon had been found dead, not from a fight, but starved and injured, far from his territory. And then the biologist told me about a new pack forming far to the west in the high scrub country. They were calling them the Ice River Pack. They were smaller, but notoriously fierce and highly effective hunters. "We haven't gotten a clean dart on the alpha yet," the biologist said, scratching his chin. "But the reports say he's enormous. Charcoal gray coat, moves like smoke, and the oddest thing, he seems to have a strange aversion to traps and human contact even more than most. He's smart, too smart." I just nodded, stirring my coffee, looking out at the pines. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I bet he is." I didn't tell the biologist about the blanket, the jerky, or the needle. That was our secret. You see, folks, the wild has its own rules, and sometimes those rules get bent, just for a moment, when survival forces two completely different creatures to look each other in the eye and recognize a shared isolation. Shadow chose to leave the pack to live, and when he was strong enough, he chose to leave me to be free. But every now and then, when I'm out deep in the bitter roots, miles from anywhere, I'll find something strange. A deer carcass, cleanly killed, the best cuts taken, but a surprisingly large portion left untouched. And sometimes, right on the edge of my camp perimeter, I'll find a single, massive paw print in the mud, perfectly formed, charcoal gray fur pressed into the damp earth, facing west. It's just a reminder. A silent message carried on the cold Montana wind, saying, "I am here. We are still two lone wolves." And in that moment, I know the greatest story I ever lived wasn't the one I captured on film, but the one I lived through, kneeling in the snow, choosing to save a wild thing, the night a lone wolf chose a human over his pack. That's a memory you carry with you, folks. That's a bond that never breaks.